Okay, so we have a quorum, so let's get going here. Check what we're doing. Let's start with the introduction of the Planning Commission. Looks like you're up first, Ed.
Ed Fleischer, District 2.
Don.
Don DeHaan, District 1.
Eric.
Eric Casino, District 2.
Scott.
Scott Nelson, District 3.
Doug.
Doug Carmen, District 2.
And is that you, Kevin?
Yes, Kevin Pessinger, District 1.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
So I'm looking for an approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Been a,
Quick discussion.
yeah, let's get through this and then we'll get right back to you.
I meant discussion of the agenda.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it's probably aspirational, but it says we're going to adjourn at 7:30. I don't think that's what it was intended.
Oh, we may.
Yeah, that's a typo.
Always hope. Okay, thanks, Kev. So we have a motion to approval of the agendas. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, so we are on to public communications. For this virtual meeting, please choose the raise your hand option if you wish to address the Planning Commission. If you are dialing in, press 9 to raise your hand. The chair host will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. Make sure you also choose 6 to unmute yourself. The 3-minute timer will show on the video screens to help keep track of time. If you have issues speaking and being heard, please disconnect from the Zoom meeting and call 360-972-6785 to make your public comment. Let's see here. I have 2. So when you start out, please introduce yourself and let us know where you're calling from, what part of the county. So we're the first one up looks like Mark.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, we got you.
Yeah, okay. Mark Hancock, Sigali Properties. Just a couple quick points that you've heard before, but an appeal before you get to your hearing. Number one is the famous postcard. The last time it was presented to you, to be honest, it was pretty neutral, and in fact, worse than neutral. It was not forthcoming. And in your last meeting, you just said, well, you're going to get copies of the postcard. I would encourage you to go back to where you were. You want copies in advance, and you want to see what they say. If the postcard is not forthcoming, it does not tell the owners of the land what's going to happen to them, then it'll end up messing up your hearing. And Scott and Raul can tell you how much fun that is, because they were there when 1,000 angry farmers showed up about maybe 10 years ago. If the postcard needs to tell people more than just it's going to affect them, it needs to say you will be affected and it will be more restrictive on your land. And if 2,700 are going to natural, there's 2 ways that that's restrictive. One is because they're going to natural, and 2 is because your staff has decided that natural should be more restrictive than is required in the WACs and the RCWs. So it basically forbids anything inside of 200 feet. And those homeowners deserve to know that before your hearing, not a postcard that says you may be affected and go try and find it on our website. That's my main one. And the second one is you really ought to do this hearing in person. If you either put it off or else move it outside so we can put masks on and we can all talk about it. To give people 3 minutes on Zoom calls for a hearing is not a hearing. And it does a real disservice to your 2,700 people, not to mention all the rest. So those are my 2 main points. Ask for the postcard now. Look at the wording yourselves and decide if you were a homeowner, if you thought it was honest enough to give you a sense of what's going on, or if it just, says go wade through our website and see if you can find it. Good luck. So that's my main point. And good luck. And I know you guys are doing a lot of work, and I appreciate all the hard and detailed work you're doing on this thing. You're doing great. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Next up is Phyllis Farr.
Greetings, Commissioners. Phyllis Farr, unincorporated Thurston County in the Sunwood Lakes neighborhood. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight about the draft SMP. I've been overwhelmed trying to read all the related documents to draft needed but practical suggestions. I really appreciate Andrew DeFobus's work and patience with me and your service in reading and providing feedback on this important plan. Thank you. As you know, I'm concerned about the no net loss requirement in the SMP. There have been obvious changes to our shoreline since the last approved SMP in 1990. I've looked at the shoreline inventory and characterization.
Sorry, Phyllis, we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go. Sorry.
Okay. I see permitting and zoning regulations designed to achieve no net loss, but I was looking for measurable indicators. I've not been able to find comparisons of measurements from baselines of 1990 or even 2013 to 2020. Evidently, we are not considering whether there has been any no net loss since 1990 or 2013 as required by the SMA, but we will proceed with the current draft and hope it will achieve no net loss until it's reviewed in another 8 years. I find this troublesome. A lot can change in 8 years and might be irreversible. Might I suggest including in the amendments or monitoring sections, the identification of measurable indicators that could be reviewed every 2 or 3 years as benchmarks in order for remedial action to be taken. I'm suggesting the following indicators for gains or losses: amount of buffer vegetation, amount of eelgrass or kelp beds, forage fish populations, shoreline erosion, riparian tree canopy, water quality, public access, armoring inventory, geoduck acreages, and other indicators as needed, such as biodiversities or impervious surfaces within 200 feet of shorelines. Specific measurements of these indicators over time, along with remedial action, are necessary to achieve the no net loss requirement in the Shoreline Management Act. Zoning and permitting regulations requirements along with mitigation projects are necessary, but they don't measure no net loss. Additionally, I would suggest language to address climate change and sea level rise in determining marine buffers and permitting. With salmon and orca recovery a statewide priority, I suggest increased efforts in nearshore restoration and limiting aquaculture expansion. According to Thurston County's SMP fact sheet number 5, counties cannot outright prohibit aquaculture, but under a local shoreline master program may regulate where and how operations occur. I would suggest limiting and phasing out the use of plastics and hydraulic harvesting. Per the Department of Ecology no net loss guidelines, quote, no uses or development, including preferred uses such as aquaculture, supersede the requirements for environmental protection. Thank you for your service, and I hope some of these suggestions are incorporated in the draft SMP.
Thank you, Phyllis. Christy, you're up.
Gentlemen, can you hear me?
You're good.
Great. Hey, I just wanted to do a shout out and thanks to all of you as the Planning Commission. There was a recent activity that allowed for a group of folks to be involved in a topic that's already been discussed. So I can't say the name of it, but I think all of you know what I'm referring to. And I just really wanted to thank you and share my appreciation. My hope is that this is a model that can be utilized in a variety of topics that come before the Planning Commission. I will tell you, I was pretty disheartened, and I'm still somewhat dismayed at the view that has been presented quite often, that citizens are sort of a parasite. And just wanted to, you know, again, encourage you that there are many of us out there who are wanting to do the right thing and the best thing for the county. And I really appreciate you all going the extra mile recently to create an opportunity, go to bat for that to happen. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate it. That's all I have.
Thanks, Christy. John Woodford.
Good evening, Commissioners. First of all, I'd just like to say I support completely the comments made by Mark Hancock, because that overlaps a lot with things that I want to say. I just very recently, I've been having some computer issues, and I just been very recently been able to see what's being presented by Andy this evening on some follow-up items and then the appendices. On the list of appendices, I find it kind of ironic that Appendix A, which is the SED report and maps, is completely missing from his outline of topics to discuss tonight. We all know by now that some 2,700 parcels have been reclassified in Appendix A, or redesignated, I should say. At the last meeting, Ms. Davis made comments about a lot of hard work went into this, and I don't deny that. But that was all done in 2013 and or earlier. And from everything I can determine, it was done in complete secrecy with no public participation or public knowledge. I just find this amazing and just incomprehensible. It seems like each of these property owners are going to have to be notified, as Mark Hancock said, and something. So far, the batting average for the planning staff on those items have been brought before the Planning Commission are 0, 0, 0. You have overturned every one of the parcels that's been brought before you at this point. All of those on Lake Lawrence and Offit Lake. There are some 2,600 plus more parcels. I would just like to say on Long Lake, where I live, sorry, I didn't mention that at the beginning, but I think most of you know me by now. I'll give you a rave notice for having redesignated Kirby Island from rural to natural. That's very appropriate. But in the LO04 to LO05 reach, which is the eastern shoreline of Long Lake, Carpenter Park should also have been designated at least rural, conservative, or natural. It's more than a quarter mile of shoreline that is basically untouched, and you have chosen to redesignate that as shoreline residential. I think that's totally inappropriate. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Next up would be Lisa Reiner.
Yes, can you hear me?
We got you now.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the comments tonight for the Thurston County Planning Commission. I would like to echo what the previous speaker just said. The designation, shoreline designation, to residential seems inappropriate. The shoreline natural designation is more appropriate because essentially we need the natural grasses and the flora and fauna coming down to the water to preserve what we have, to preserve the water. More and more studies now are coming out that document how the native grasses that grow in our lakes and streams contribute to the water quality, and having the natural slope from the shoreline and the natural access to the shoreline gives the aquatic flora and fauna the ability to do their jobs, which is to provide oxygen to that water column. And of course, gives oxygen to the animals, the critters, the fish that live in that water body. So I've been listening to over the years discussion about hardening of the shoreline. I am against hardening of the shoreline, being able to put up a concrete wall against a lake or against a river or against Puget Sound. I again see the importance of being able to have the natural flora and fauna come down to the water and interact. That's part of Mother Nature's plan to keep the water clean and oxygenated. And so thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Is there anybody else on the chat here that would like to get up and speak for their 3 minutes? I'm not seeing any other hands, so we'll be moving forward. Looking for an approval of meeting minutes for June 2nd, 2021 and June 16th, 2021. Looking for a motion to approve those.
So moved.
Second.
Been approved and seconded to approve the meeting minutes for June 2nd and June 16th. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you, guys. So let's move into the work session on the Shoreline Master Program. We'll turn it over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Chair Simmons. Good evening, Planning Commission. Andrew DeFobis, Community Planning. So tonight we'll continue our discussion of the Shoreline Master Program. We are into the appendices and then some remaining policy items in the document to bring back to you. Staff previously sent out a memo on those items last week, and I'll also have a PowerPoint for later in this evening, which is now on the Planning Commission website. So we're looking for specific language to include in the draft or policy options that you would like to take to public hearing. Once all those items are settled, we will return to you with a public hearing draft that has all of your feedback in it to date. And that's essentially the finish line for this phase of the draft review. And we've cleared, the deck for this meeting and the following meeting to wrap up these items and hopefully get a draft ready for public hearing. And then we do have the next phase of our public outreach is set to launch in August. That will be an extended period of outreach where we'll have a virtual open house that runs for 4 weeks or so. We'll also be doing that direct postcard notice or postcard mailing to the folks that are most affected and doing outreach to interested parties as well. So ahead of tonight's meeting, we did receive 3 written comments. All of those were forwarded to Planning Commission and have been posted on the Planning Commission's website. They will also be added to the public comment record. So all 3 of them touched on the concept of no net loss in the Shoreline Master Program and advocated for a net gain standard. And 2 of those items also specifically addressed management of Black Lake. So we'll go ahead and start reviewing the appendices. One comment I would make is that the draft SMP, the text of it includes appendices B, C, and D, and there is an Appendix A. It is indeed the map of the proposed shoreline environment designations. We are working on an updated map that reflects the decisions that Planning Commission has made on changing some of those shoreline environment designations. So when the whole package comes back to you, you will indeed see Appendix A, the map, and it will reflect those 3 specific meetings that we had where Planning Commission made decisions on some of those environment designations. So with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen. We'll jump into the draft. So we'll start with Appendix B, which is mitigation options to achieve no net loss for new or redevelopment activities. I did want to point out that per Planning Commission direction, this chapter includes a policy option for the public to consider including decks as a pervious surface if they are designed to allow water to infiltrate the ground below. Anywhere where there are calls for graded material on decks and things like that, or docks rather, that's limited to salmon-bearing lakes and marine waters. I think that's a policy option. And then there also have been some references inserted for the county's habitat conservation plan, just in in consult with the other staff at the county who are working on that program, because these things do overlap. So that's Appendix B. Does anyone have any comments, questions, anything in Appendix B that they wish to bring forward at this time?
I do.
Okay.
This is Kevin. Just a question about the comment you made about having received 3 public comments in writing in advance. I saw one from Joseph Hiss and one from Esther and Suzanne. Who was the third one from?
The third one was from Phyllis Farr, who also spoke this evening. I believe that was the packet mailed out this afternoon.
I got it. I received it. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. We sometimes, we'll receive public comments up to the wee minutes before the meeting, and we try to get those out to the Planning Commission, and usually we'll send whatever we have by late afternoon, so you have a chance to take a look at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Are there any questions specifically on Appendix B? Otherwise, I will move us on to Appendix C, which is our restoration plan. So scroll and hopefully not make anyone ill. Oops, there we go. Okay. So this is the restoration plan, and you will see as we scroll through here, there's little notes and things that I still have little last minute things to do. So when you see the draft again, those things will all be gone. You will have a clean copy, and then for reference, there will also be that Technicolor Dream code, as I've been calling it, that has all of the edits over the past couple iterations. So pardon my mess as we move through here. Are there any comments on Appendix C, the shoreline restoration plan? And if not, Appendix D is the last one we're going to look at appendix-wise. That is our channel migration zone maps. So the county is required to identify channel migration zones as part of the shoreline planning process. They are considered part of the critical freshwater habitat, as you know, is something that, requires special policy consideration in the SMP. And so Appendix D is essentially all of the technical details of those channel migration zone maps. So we worked with ecology to produce maps. This talks about those and provides some of the metadata and where those maps are located. And we do have those, as part of the package that we'll take to public hearing, the actual maps that were produced. Are there any questions on Appendix D? Okay, then I am going to shift gears here and I'm going to pull up the memo that was produced with some remaining policy items, just some things that either Planning Commission had previously weighed in on, asked staff to research, or things that staff realized could use another round of review, or just wanted to get Planning Commission feedback before plopping them in the draft. And so most of these topics should seem familiar just based on how much time we have talked about them. Okay, so the first one we'll talk about here are construction setbacks. So this is essentially a distance that would be added to the shoreline buffer in order to protect the buffer during construction. So during previous Planning Commission meetings, the Planning Commission asked staff to look into whether that construction setback is a requirement of state law, if there might be other options for the Planning Commission to consider on that topic. And so what I found out is that construction setbacks are not a requirement of state law. You see them in a lot of shoreline master programs. Again, the purpose is to protect the buffer. All of our regulations, including the buffers, whether or not they include a construction setback, must show that they achieve no net loss of ecological function. So if the Planning Commission wishes to remove the building setbacks from the draft, we can do that. That will need to be analyzed when we do the next round of review on the cumulative impacts analysis. So anything that is changed in the draft that potentially leads to more development or development closer to the shoreline, or kind of moves the goalposts on previous drafts that the cumulative impacts analysis was based on, we'll be analyzing that again. So one option the Planning Commission could do is to keep the setback and allow the approval authority to reduce it or waive it if it can be demonstrated the project won't impact the buffer. If the Planning Commission does want to remove that building setback, then staff would recommend that language be added to the draft, that the site plan actually show the proposed extent of construction activities, because that would then factor into the mitigation that would potentially be required on that project. So if it's a 100-foot buffer and there is no construction setback to protect that buffer, and there will be activities in that buffer resulting from the construction that cause an impact, the permanent loss of vegetation, something like that, we would want to know that on the site plan, because technically any impacts to the buffer would need to be mitigated. So I will, oh, and one other aspect there just to keep in mind is that, as we've discussed, protections for critical areas in shoreline jurisdiction are going to be folded into the master program. So critical areas in shoreline jurisdiction must still be protected. And the critical areas ordinance language does require that 15-foot setback. So if the Planning Commission wishes to remove that setback, that would not apply to areas where shoreline jurisdiction also has critical areas, such as steep slopes or wetlands. And there I will pause and see if you have any questions, or see if there is direction from the Planning Commission or to make a change to the draft.
I have a question, Andrew. When you're talking about mitigation, would you define mitigation? Does that mean restore and replace, or just what does it mean?
Right, mitigation. So there's a mitigation sequence that has to be applied to projects, and applicants are required to show that there are impacts, or that they can't avoid impacts to the shoreline. If they can't, they have to minimize those and show how they're doing that. And for anything that can't be avoided or minimized, that's where mitigation comes in. And it's specifically replacing function that is lost through the development that you cannot avoid or you can't minimize. And so that could include, in this case, potentially planting. So if someone were to impact the outer edge of the buffer during construction, a mitigation measure might be to replant that area so that those functions can be returned. And so it really just depends on what the project is as to what mitigation might be required. If you're adding additional impervious surface, in a buffer, perhaps a mitigation measure is removing it somewhere else if that's an option. So there's different options in play there, but generally the concept of mitigation as we use it here is to replace a function that is lost because of the development that is approved.
So restoration is one form of mitigation.
In that context, yes. Yeah. If there's a direct impact that results from the activity, restoring that area, once the construction is done, would be one mitigation option. So the question for Planning Commission would be, again, it is not required by state law to have a setback. So I'm looking for thoughts on how you wish to proceed with the draft language.
Go ahead, Doug.
My concern with the setback is primarily with existing construction. You have houses that are already there, they do some remodeling. The practicality of a 15-foot setback to the buffer is not practical in many cases. So I would favor trying to separate new construction from existing construction, if that can be done. If not, I'd be in favor of removing the 15-foot buffer so that you can decide where it's appropriate and where it isn't.
Mm-hmm. And that could be something to look at, because I know there's some language in the non-conforming chapter, or excuse me, in chapter 19400, which addresses non-conforming uses, among other things. There's language as to, what is subject to those rules and what is not, when are they triggered. And so we could look at, if you're doing remodeling entirely within the confines or the existing footprint, I don't know that that would be a requirement. So I don't know if that would address your concern or not, but I suppose if you have an existing home and there is, let's say it is non-conforming and, it's 65 feet from the water in an area where the buffer should be 150 feet, and there's going to be impacts to that buffer during the remodeling, we could potentially require the mitigation, the restoration of that area, but we wouldn't necessarily have to add a setback. I don't know if that's addressing your concerns or not, but we can certainly switch over to the draft and look at it, but that might be an option to add some language there.
It's totally impractical in most cases with existing houses to talk about a 15-foot. I mean, my house on the lake is 30 feet back from the water and was built before the SMP was in force, and setbacks weren't applied at that time. So if I were to do something on my house, I'm going to be in the buffer. If I paint it, any kind of maintenance, work on the deck, any of that stuff, and I'm going to be impacting the lawn, which is really not that much of a critical area. But anyway, the key there is new construction. Someone's got a vacant lot and they're putting a new house on it. That's one thing. Someone's remodeling an existing home, that's another. So I'd prefer having some kind of language that differentiates the two.
I think that I'm similar to Doug on this, except where I'm at is that the 15-foot setback isn't near as important to me as what actually happens inside the buffer. The whole idea that construction can impact a buffer, say you want to drive a piece of equipment into the buffer, that's a much bigger deal to me than whether or not it's 15 feet away or not. So if we can analyze those impacts during the proposals, during pre-construction, the 15 feet doesn't matter so much to me as making sure that they take care of things within the buffer that their development impacts.
And I think that the critical areas ordinance, I believe it does allow that 15-foot distance to be lessened or waived depending on exactly what you said, an analysis of the actual project and the construction methods and the site envelope. So that could be something to do as well.
I like that a lot better too, because like Doug was saying, if the construction activity is on somebody's front lawn, well, that's not really going to impact a buffer a whole lot because it's already a lawn. So then telling them that they got to be 15 feet behind that anyways, it doesn't make any sense. It'd be a whole lot better to have somebody that's reviewing this construction plan to be able to say, yeah, this isn't a big deal, or it's just a temporal effect that can be mitigated elsewhere. But I think having a hard and fast rule of stay 15 feet back, I think that's more cumbersome than it really needs to be.
And by my review of the draft, I do believe those standards were only intended to apply to new development. It does, but you know what? It doesn't say that. So I can understand the confusion or the potential for confusion. But again, that said, yes, technically that if that home is non-conforming, if it's in the buffer and you've got native vegetation up to your porch versus you've got just lawn, that is a difference in impact, right? There's more function to be lost by removing some of that native vegetation, and we already have standards that would require that to be restored. So we've talked about how the existing development, whatever we want to call it, you're not necessarily going to need the same permits for that work that you would need for building a new home in that spot or in that area. But if there are impacts that result from whatever you're doing, mitigation will be required. I mean, that's kind of a blanket provision of the SMP. So, and that's not being lost here. So regardless of what we change here, that remains the same. So one thing I could do, I could look at mimicking just the language from the CAO, because I do believe it does provide for the ability to lessen that area. And that's kind of one of the options that I had put in this memo here, was just, give the approval authority the ability to waive it if it's not going to be necessary. But at the end of the day, if that buffer is impacted, we will require mitigation, and that is otherwise covered in this document.
This Ed, I think I agree with both those points. I mean, I liked that more option in your memo. that given the approving authority ability to waive it, because it's always case by case on what this project is. And also on, on that point on like, there's a difference between new construction and doing a repair or something on a house that may already be in the buffer because the buffer didn't exist when the house was built. I think we got to recognize that those are two different situations. But it sounds like you could do something with that.
Yeah. So I'm seeing some support for that concept of, adding the ability for us to administratively reduce or waive that setback. Is that something that has pretty broad support, Planning Commission? So I can, yep. Okay, great. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. So I'm going to make that note and then we can move on.
Andrew, I get one more point here. The critical areas ordinance gave the SMP the responsibility to do all the shoreline stuff. And so, and I've asked this question before. In this last sentence here, it says the critical areas ordinance provision are being adopted in this program by reference. And so it's like, is the Shoreline Master Program supposed to take care of the shorelines, or are we using some in the SMP and some in the critical areas ordinance, and are required to do that?
Yes, we are doing both, and it is very confusing. And I have spent a lot of hours looking at this and trying to wrap my brain around it. But the Shoreline Management Act sets out those specific shorelines that are subject to that act, and we all could recite those, right? It's the lakes, the streams, marine shorelines, the associated wetlands and floodplains, and all those things. But then there are also provisions that say if you have other critical areas in shoreline jurisdiction, you must still protect those, and that protection is done through the Shoreline Master Program. The way that jurisdictions often do that is by either adopting a critical areas ordinance by reference into the SMP, by cutting and pasting the standards into the draft, or by creating a separate appendix which has excerpts from the CAO so that people know at a glance exactly which standards in the CAO might apply in shoreline jurisdiction. And that's the approach that we're taking, because not every single word, verse, and chapter of the critical areas ordinance is going to apply anymore. All of the administration of permits within shoreline jurisdiction is handled solely by the SMP. So all the critical area review permits, reasonable use exceptions, all those things, they're gone, and they're replaced with the shoreline permitting. So at the same time, there are also statutes that say that you have to have the same level of protection for your critical areas under the SMP that they had in the CAO. And so that's why for those specific shorelines that are mandated under the SMA, the lakes, the marine, the streams, those, we can make some changes with things like the setbacks or non-conforming things. But when it's something that was otherwise regulated by the critical areas ordinance, such as a wetland or a steep slope, come into play, or habitat, that's where those critical areas ordinance provisions are still going to apply. So I'll use the example of a lake, a 25-acre lake that is subject to the Shoreline Master Program. The rules are going to be a bit different for that versus that another lake that has lake fringe wetlands all around it, and is also going to have those critical area standards apply. So it really depends. It's site specific. You're looking at the specific property and trying to see where all these different things overlap. But frankly, some of those critical area provisions are going to remain for those areas that are affected by both shorelines and critical areas. And right now, it's the same thing we have right now, except on top of that, we have two sets of permits. So today, if you were to build something and you have critical areas and shorelines, both regulatory codes apply and both permitting systems apply. And so through the SMP update, we are folding in, the critical area standards because state law says that they still apply in shoreline jurisdiction, but we are going to have one permit system, for anything within shoreline jurisdiction.
My preference would be to take what's in the critical areas ordinance that we have to put in the SMP and put it in the SMP rather than adopt it by referral or reference. It's simpler that way for the consumer. It costs less because you're not jumping around between documents.
Yeah.
And it's just a better system.
Yeah, and that's a greater policy consideration that we would have to look at because, there are different templates for how we would do it. And the ecology handbook talks about the ones that I mentioned, which are to literally cut and paste, to adopt by reference, or to do an appendix that uses the applicable standards, which is sort of a hybrid model of the first two. And that is the system that at a previous date and time, prior to me working on this project, that's what we chose to go with. And so that is what at this time has been prepared and is moving forward, is that separate appendix that has those chapters which are applicable. So
You're saying you've chosen the option to put it in an appendix?
Not that I didn't choose that, but
that's the choice that was made.
That is the choice that was
Brad.
made. So if that were something to revisit, that's a broader policy conversation. And that's certainly fair game for Planning Commission to consider. It's up for grabs. So I don't know if there is, support from other seatmates on that, but, I would want to go back and talk to Jennifer about that as well, because I think that would be a fairly significant undertaking to figure out how to weave all these standards from critical areas into the Shoreline Master Program, when we're already fairly close to the end of this round of review with this other method.
Well, as an appendix, it'll be part of the SMP, right? It'll literally be an appendix. I'm just getting clarity from Andy.
That's correct. And that will be part of the training that we do with staff, and it'll be part of the educational materials that we produce for our citizens so that everyone knows how the whole thing operates. And we already do have a fact sheet out there on our website that talks about the interplay between critical areas ordinance and Shoreline Master Program, because it is very complex.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's actually clearer because it's going to be there in black and white as part of the SMP, as opposed to like a reference to a code that may change over time. And I think that's probably why the decision was made, although I wasn't there. And at this point, since we're so far along and trying to wrap up this thing in terms of going to public hearing in like the next couple of meetings, it probably makes sense just to stick on the track of keeping that in an appendix. But we could ask that question and ask that question of our staff as well. I think we have, but we could revisit it to see what works best in terms of clarity for folks and understanding. Because we're not gonna regulate steep slopes less in the SMP than we do in the CAO, right? It's based on science, it's based on public safety. So we're gonna have to keep pace over time with these standards as science changes, but at least it would be a one-stop shop in terms of going to the SMP and looking at the appendix to see if I have a steep slope, what that means for my permit.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any?
I know I like it. The idea of having it as appendix is appealing to me, especially since I think, the one-stop shop thing is really a good idea. And moreover, I don't want to set this back another year. I'd like to move forward.
And that could also be this could also be something that the public wishes to weigh in on as well. One point, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but yes, we are getting close to this round of public review, but on the other side of hearing, there's another opportunity for the entire document to, it all becomes fair game, right? Based on public input, to make revisions to that draft. And so if we have a groundswell of support for that, that's also another way we could consider that.
Yeah, I think I like the approach, sort of the middle approach, keeping it in the appendix, where if you actually adopt it as part of the code, that could solve some problems, but create others down the road.
Is there anything else on that topic for this evening from anyone? Otherwise, okay. So we'll move on to accessory dwelling units and give you an update and then ask you another question. Previously, the Planning Commission asked staff to look into, you give some direction on permitting requirements for accessory dwelling units in all the shoreline jurisdictions. But one thing you asked me to look at was whether accessory dwelling units could be considered exempt from a substantial development permit under state law. As a reminder and refresher, the state law carves out specific exceptions from a shoreline substantial development permit for a whole host of development that can occur on the shorelines. One of those things is single family home development. And so I ran that question back to ecology and said, you know, Planning Commission is interested in exempting ADUs or accessory dwelling units in addition to single family homes. What do you think about that? And, you know, what I was told is that that exemption is for single family homes, for one single family home for principal use on that property, and that those standards are construed pretty narrowly, and that an ADU would not meet the definition of an appurtenance under the WAC, the 173.27.040, which is where all those exemptions to permitting would continue, or would be rather. So I made the other changes that Planning Commission requested as far as the permitting. You'll see that in the next version of the draft, but I wanted to put that on your radar that they, you know, ecology is unlikely to support that or likely to refute that if we put an exemption to a substantial development permit in the draft. So my question for you was, okay, so yeah, whether you wanted to see ADUs be a substantial development permit. You also have the option to do an administrative substantial development permit, as you know. So just coming back and circling back on that and seeing how you wish to proceed in the draft in that arena. Any comments?
I liked your suggestion, the last paragraph.
Okay. And yeah, and we're going to get there as well. And I have some, we could look at the language, but how do you have any thoughts on the permit type that you would like to see in the draft?
Good question, Andy. Does it make any difference whether this ADU in the protected area, the shoreline area, is on septic or sewer?
Not specifically as the draft is written, but I, would imagine that's something that we'd have to look at in terms of what are the impacts of that development going to be. So the language does not specifically address it, no. But that is part of the overall review that would occur.
Building code would review it.
Yes, and
it has to meet the code. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Carmen. Yeah, that's a great point. That again, we're focused on shorelines and it's a big topic, but there are other levels of review that go into a building permit. Environmental health is going to look at it to make sure it meets their rules. Building is going to look at it. Development review for all the impervious surface and the road access and all those things. So yeah, SMP is only one piece of the overall analysis. But I'm going to quickly go to
I'm in favor of an administrative SDP.
Okay, and for the record, that would be in line with what you directed or promoted for the shoreline residential SED for primary single family residences. So if that change were made, that would dovetail with what you suggested previously. So I'm seeing two nodding heads. What do folks say about that? Okay, great. Well, I can go ahead and make that change. Let me note that down. Okay, and then yes, we can go to, let's see, is the memo still up? There we are. Okay. Okay, so as I said, an update for you and then a question, right? So that was the update. And then so I had another question for you just based on looking at this issue and realizing there really weren't any other specific development standards specifically for accessory dwelling units and, attempting to, achieve no net loss or limit the, potential effects of that development. And so some thoughts that I had was, should there be language in the draft that addresses accessory dwelling units and states a preference or a requirement for them to be placed either landward of the existing structure or to attach them to an existing structure either above or beside before they would be allowed to be, separate from them or closer to the water or something like that. I want to point out that all the buffer provisions would still apply here. The mitigation standards would apply here, and any standards for existing, AKA non-conforming development would all would be in play. And so the question is, when we're looking at ways to minimize impacts in shoreline jurisdiction, are there any other considerations that the draft should contain, such as exactly where they are located relative to the main structure? And Commissioner Carmen, I think you expressed support for at least some of that.
That to me feels like a case by case sort of situation. I mean, if the main house is far enough back and you can still put an ADU without affecting the buffer, why does it, why do we have to say that it has to go here or here? It just seems like there may be, I don't know how many of those kind of opportunities would be out there, but I think you're right. Bring it in and see what it looks like.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to add any language at all. When I was looking at this, I realized that, in all these other development standards in 19600, there's lots of language about how it needs to be designed to minimize its effect on the shoreline. But I didn't see that language for accessory dwelling units. And so this is an opportunity to put some in if Planning Commission wishes to do so, but it's not a requirement.
And I think I agree with Jim. I mean, is it needed? Because wouldn't the new construction standards or the if it's a separate building or the remodeling standards that would apply to the house apply just as well here? I mean, I don't know why we need new standards here. It's if it's an add-on to the house, the difference between a remodel and an ADU is very little, but so I'm not quite seeing where I think it's fine as is, I guess I'm saying.
Okay.
Well, an ADU is not just an addition. An ADU is an additional dwelling unit so that you have family in it. Like we went through that code change a few months ago. And so this is single family residence basically. And so but we are allowing ADUs in certain areas. So the question is, do we allow it here or not?
I think that along with what Jim was saying earlier, there might be situations where the only place that an ADU could be constructed would be between the home and the buffer, because the home is up against a road or a setback or a septic system or something like that. And, if there is 100 feet between the home and the buffer and they weren't allowed to use that for an ADU, and they couldn't put it back in behind the house, I wouldn't want to take that opportunity away from somebody.
Right. Yeah. And that was just the question is if there should be a preference or something like that. We have other language in other places where it says, whenever practical, practicable, you shall design this way or that way. So again, it's not a requirement, but kind of what I'm thinking here is that if you have an ADU that is added above an existing garage and you have parking that is enabled, on existing impervious surface, that is a smaller impact related to that development versus a separate ADU that is put either the same distance or closer to the shoreline with additional impervious surface. So that's the thought there, because again, any changes that we make to the draft or anything we allow in the draft, we'll have to look at that through the cumulative impacts analysis. So I always have that going in my brain as well, that we're going to have to essentially justify the Shoreline Master Program and show how it's meeting no net loss. But again, this is just options for your consideration. Nothing you have to do. Just bringing it back, to be able to put this issue to rest ahead of the public hearing.
Andy, how would you make a preference for something above or behind the house instead of on the water side? How would that work? That you'd give preferential treatment to that? What would be the carrot instead of the stick?
not necessarily preferential treatment, but stating similar like we do with shoreline stabilization, that you have to show that you can't do something before we allow it to be in that situation. So demonstrate that it's not feasible to put it above an existing garage or behind the structure or something like that before we would allow it to be closer to than the existing residence. So that's how I believe that would be achieved, if that's a direction Planning Commission is interested in pursuing.
I appreciate that that position on it, but I think I'd rather leave it be.
Okay. Is there other thoughts on that? Other folks to agree with Eric? Yep. Okay. Seeing nodding heads, we will move on. Okay. So view blockage standards. And I apologize here, it says view protection standards. In the draft, it's view blockage. So there is a whole section of the draft SMP that talks about how new development can be located relative to existing development that would occur on either side of it. So essentially, if you're building on a lot and both your neighbors have built their houses, that language would govern exactly where you can build your structure relative to the shoreline. So Planning Commission asked staff to go back and look at whether that is required by state law. And I went and did some research and talked to ecology, and those view blockage standards are not required by state law. So oftentimes they are put in an SMP so that there is clarity on the matter, and that, you know, it tries to strike a balance between property rights and avoiding conflicts between neighbors. But, you know, they are not required by state law. And previously the Planning Commission had said, you know, let's take this out if it is not required by state law. So I'm just circling back and giving you that update that it's not required. If you wish to remove it, let me know, and I will go ahead and strike that for the public hearing. So Eric is nodding.
I'm in favor of taking it out.
Okay. Okay.
Now, in taking it out, I mean, there's two aspects to view protection. One is, and you have examples in one of the chapters, it shows, you know, two houses built way back in the buffer. And so a new house could be built in front and theoretically block view from both of them. That's one issue. Another issue would be just the reverse of that. You got two older homes that were built, let's say 30 feet back from the shoreline. And if you take this out, then would that new house that goes in between them have to then be built at the 50-foot versus parallel to the other two like they currently do?
I'd have to go and look at the draft. I'm not sure that the draft, so in that instance where you have two homes that are really close to the water and you're the lot in the middle, I'm not sure that we allow that. So you mentioned 50 feet. That's the standard buffer that is proposed for the shoreline residential environment. I'm not sure that we allow any reduction in that buffer without a variance. So I could look at that.
Doug, I think in your example, that's always stuff that happens outside of the buffer anyways. It'd be like the difference between two homes that were built at 65 feet, not at under 50.
Let me try to quickly go there and see what I can find. So it is showing, well, maybe I can switch here. Hang on. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing the draft. So we can kind of look at the different scenarios that are talked about here. So here's a scenario where you don't have any development. You're the first one on the block. So your buffer is going to be, you know, the buffer that is required by the program. And this language does have the building setback in here, just because this image has been around for a while. And then here's the next example where you have your, let's see. Yeah, okay, so this is where you have an existing primary structure and it is further back from the buffer. The buffer that you would have for the new development would be no less than what your neighbor had, or the buffer required by the program, whichever is greater. So theoretically, you could be required to be further back from the shoreline if your neighbor is already closer.
Andrew, does this take into account elevation changes at all?
Yes, further in the draft, it does. It says there are some mitigating factors. And so if you know, because we're looking at this top down and we can't see if there is, you know, changes in elevation or significant vegetation on a lot where there's really not a lot of view anyway. Those sorts of things are built into this. So let's see. I think that's the same one. So yeah, this is essentially, hard to read the stuff on the fly. Okay, and so, and here's another example, Commissioner Carmen, where you were talking about where you have the buffer, you have one structure that is pretty close to that buffer and you have one that's way back, then the new structure would potentially have to accommodate the views of the existing ones. And
But
then,
if we took out the view requirement, that wouldn't happen, right? That wouldn't be the case.
yeah, that's the issue here. That's the question here.
Right.
Again, it's none of this is required. It's pretty common in shoreline master programs. And there are, again, the reasons I talked about is why it's in here, but it's not required. And I wanted to look at that. Okay, here's number 5, just for Commissioner DeHaan's question. The structure setback line may be administratively waived when an elevation survey determines that due to a difference in topography, or a vegetation survey demonstrates due to presence of significant view blocking vegetation on or adjacent to the common border of the two parcels, that the proposed building will not result in any view blockage. So it is possible to waive these standards, but if those circumstances do not exist, then these standards would apply, you know, if this draft proceeds as written. And one option would be to, you know, if you're not ready to make a decision on this, to leave it in for the public hearing. And I can amend the options that are written in the draft here that would just call attention to that. Now, you know, that could be something we have the public weigh in on. So that's also an option.
I'm still in favor of our original discussion where we decided to remove them.
Okay.
I am too.
Okay.
Me
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Carmen. Did you say?
I just said me 3. Me also.
Me 4.
Okay. 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 I will take them out. Okay. Let me switch back to the memo.
Andrew, just on this subject before we go away, what, like if somebody builds in my line of sight without this in there, is what, if we take this out, then I have no recourse?
It becomes a civil matter, and I don't know how, you know, yeah, I don't know how you proceed with that, but it's not the county's problem anymore.
Okay, well, that concerns me a little bit, like, you know, my evil neighbor or something coming in and just putting something where he wants. And so I guess I'm kind of on the fence on this one.
I don't think that the neighbor can still intrude into the buffering, and he could just come right up to the line like he would normally do. But my big concerns with this is I don't want one neighbor that's already developed to then have power over somebody else to tell them where they can put their house. I don't think that's, I think if you don't like what your neighbor was doing, or you don't want him building on that lot, you should have bought it. You shouldn't have just.
I can go with that. Okay, thank you.
All parts of the usual discussion when this issue comes up. Yeah. Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about mooring structures for the next several items here, one of our favorite topics. Okay, so I wanted some clarification from Planning Commission. You had asked me about inserting a couple things in here about how, like, making accommodations for docks to be able to increase the length if the depth is too shallow for moorage close to the shoreline, or to increase the length if the location and configuration of a neighboring dock presents a conflict. It's just not logistically sound to build a smaller one because of the configuration of a neighboring dock. And in going through and looking back at this issue, I realized that the SMP draft, as far as I can tell, does not have any general standards in it that cap the length of piers and docks. So we have, standards in there that talk about it's got to be the minimum necessary to get the job done. Essentially, the applicant has to demonstrate that it is the minimum size for the intended use, but there is no language in there about lengths. There's some square footage for floats and things like that, but I didn't find anything for piers and docks. So I still have my notes to make the changes that you suggested, but forgive me, I couldn't recall whether we had discussed this issue before, and wanted to go back and see is there any guidance Planning Commission wishes to provide, or any desire to include any language that put dimensional standards on docks. We've got them for the width, not for the length. Just checking the pulse here before I move forward on this issue.
Well, Andrew, I'm looking for the section that showed the docks in the document, and there was a width specified, there was a length specified in that section.
I don't think
when we talked about it.
I don't know that there are lengths specified specifically for docks and piers. That's what I was looking for. And if I've missed it, I will apologize for wasting time. I know
What
that
section is that in?
19600 160, I believe. And so I did.
No, there's a section that actually shows diagrams of docks.
Yes, but I don't believe that it actually does show. It talks about the spacing between piers, pilings, and it talks about the width, right? And we've talked about the increasing those widths for the public hearing draft. I don't recall that it did have length standards.
Well, I'm going to try to find it, and we'll see.
Okay. I will go there as well.
Okay, little. Toby, go. Come here, you kiss. Okay. And
yeah, okay. So I'm finding it. Well, here I can pull it up. Okay. Let's see here. Well, so I'm going to just go up to the top and we can take a look. So here's general development standards. And we can kind of scroll through and take a look. But so letter B here talks about how they have to support water dependent uses, and also says, yes, they have to be the minimum size required to meet the intended use. No, sorry, that's letter E. Okay. Letter E, overwater structures shall be constructed to the minimum size necessary to meet the needs of the use. And again, there are width standards in here, but I'll keep looking, but I didn't think there were lengths. And the thing that caught me was that the current SMP does have lengths in it. So I just wanted to have that conversation and, see if there is an interest or desire to do anything that's analogous to the current SMP, or just, I didn't want it, to just go without checking back on this one.
Yeah, the diagrams gives a length and width for floats, and does not give a length for, it's on page 118.
Right. Wait.
And then just
Oh.
give us the spacing of the piers. Well,
page.
maybe it's a different version, maybe.
Pages have jumped a little bit. Yeah.
Section
Yep. There it is.
there.
So, yep. So this is, yeah. I didn't see, and I did talk to Brad about this, and I know he mentioned the conversation with square footage, but I wasn't finding how it was all sewed up in the draft.
Yeah.
And so this talks about the recreational float, the floats attached to ramp and pier, but that pier itself, there's no conversation about how long that is, where there is in the current SMP.
Okay. So, but we had notes about the width and whatnot. I don't see any notes on your document.
Those are, yeah, I do have those in here.
Okay. Someplace else, right?
So right here, if you're looking,
Okay.
the option for public hearing, right now it's in as an option. And then I have notes other places in the draft that are going to need to be changed if that option is what, we ultimately approve.
My main concern with length is that there are places where you have to go further than 100 feet or whatever in order to get a place that you can actually moor your boat.
Mhm.
They've had problems like that on Lake Lawrence, that they're told, nope, you can only go 50 feet, that's it. Well, you got to be 75 in order to park a boat at. So I guess according to the SMP, the person wouldn't be allowed to build the dock because it's not for boat access. Right? Because it says the purpose of a dock is solely for accessing a watercraft.
Yeah.
Not for swimming or anything else, but just accessing a watercraft.
So one option could be to use a length standard, perhaps the ones that are in the current SMP, perhaps something different, but attach those other considerations to that. Because I think that's what's missing is, it says the minimum size necessary, and then there's those other things that Planning Commission has told me to put in, which is the minimum, get to up to minimum depth for moorage and, to avoid conflict with your neighbors. But to me, the missing middle piece of that is there a standard width, that we would not exceed unless one of those other situations kicks in. So unless you need it for the moorage or unless there is a conflict, you would be limited to X number of feet. The current draft does that. This draft does not. Sorry, the current SMP does that. This draft does not.
The current SMP does what? You confused me.
Current SMP puts a length, it caps docks at a certain length.
Okay, this one doesn't.
Correct.
And you added somewhere in here about the 2 to 3 feet or 3 to 4 feet depth.
I'm planning to do that. But I wanted to. I was going to put all that stuff in here. That's what I was working on, and then that's when I went back and looked at the current SMP, and that's when I realized that the length standards, I didn't see them in this draft. So I haven't made those changes yet. I'm going to, but I wanted to circle back and ask about just a standard length, if I should put that in as well, or not.
I guess my thought is that we just need to provide for someone to be able to park a boat at a dock, which means depth, as long as we're not limiting the length.
Wouldn't that happen during the application phase where they were trying to demonstrate their need for the dock? That's when they would say, I have to have it so many feet because I'm looking for 3 feet of water at this particular point? Is that where that would happen?
I would think so. Yeah. So the draft does say it's got to be the minimum size necessary for the intended use. But there was no clarification about moorage depth or to avoid conflict with neighbors. So that's what I was going to add in.
Yeah, so, and I think that's adequate as long as the code people allow it, because that's what happened to Lake Lawrence, is the people were told they're not allowed to go that far out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that the current draft, or sorry, I keep mixing up my words. I don't think the current SMP, the 1990 SMP, I don't know that it has that same provision in there about minimum, distance or whatever. So I think this could potentially be something that increases flexibility in the draft once I put that language in there. Okay, so I heard a proposal to waive any sort of standard length in the SMP, and I see Eric nodding. What do other folks think about that? Yep. Okay. Okay.
Andy, while we're there, I'm sorry to backtrack on this, but I'm hoping you can give me a quick and easy explanation. How come on the ramps down off of a pier, it's supposed to be 60% graded, but then everywhere else, like on the floats or the docks themselves, it's 50% graded?
I wouldn't know without going and looking at where that language potentially came from.
Sounds like you'd have to use two different materials then.
Well, this says, okay, so it says exceptions to these standards may be permitted where need is demonstrated and where approved by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So perhaps that language comes from them, the 60%. That's just a general shout out I will give here, or a reminder is that regardless of whatever standards we put in the SMP, there are other agencies that are going to regulate any use that's occurring over the water like this. So, you know, they will still potentially need to get Army Corps approval and Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that could be why, but I don't know without looking further. Okay, so I will, we will not include any sort of standard length for docks, but we will put in those other standards about the moorage depth and conflict with neighboring structures. Okay. Alrighty. So looking at the use of transparent decking on floats. And so this is specifically an issue or a question in marine water and salmon-bearing lakes. So the draft requires, as written, that I believe it's 50% of the surface of the float is transparent material to allow light to be transmitted through that float. And a question was raised as, well, would the actual float material, the barrels or whatever it is, actually prevent that light from getting through? And so I did talk to ecology about that, and their response was basically that, well, those things should be designed to avoid that outcome if you're trying to achieve light transmission. I did go back and look, you know, I just kind of looked through some designs of how these things are put together, and you know, there are a lot of designs out there that it would appear would allow for that. There's enough open area below the deck surface of that float that is directly to water and not overlying the barrel or whatever you're using for the float. So theoretically, that provision could remain, and the requirement would be that the floats that are designed are meeting that standard. So I just wanted to revisit that item with the Planning Commission and see what you think about that, just based on that information.
I just find it interesting that they say you got to figure out how to do it. That's like saying, figure out how to stamp out cancer, you know?
Well, I mean, I'm not trying to, I don't know, be glib or paraphrase what they said, but essentially the response was, you know, the expectation would be that if you're trying to, that you would design these in a way where that's not an issue. And from what I looked at online, I mean, because it made sense to me when we were talking about it. And then I went back and looked at how some of the configurations of how these things are put together. And, you know, the ballast material underneath the float does not necessarily have to comprise a majority of that area under the float. And therefore, there should be enough open space in that deck to allow for use of transparent materials to actually have that transmit through the water column. So that would be my recommendation, is to leave that as is. But again, I'm bringing it back because the question was raised by the Planning Commission.
In looking at those materials, Andy, what type of materials were they?
I saw a lot of like wooden barrels and things like that. Or you could potentially use plastic. I'm not sure if we don't have any sort of prohibition on that. It just can't be something that's toxic or, you know, you might be able, I'd have to look and see, you might be able to use foam, but I'm not sure if we allow that, if it's wrapped or not, but I'm not sure.
Well, you can't use foam to float if you got, it takes up too much room in order to float the float.
Hmm.
I mean, you need almost 50% coverage of float material alone in order to keep a float up and from flipping over or whatever. Or bouncing around.
Yeah.
I don't know whether any of you have walked on a dock, but it's just every step you take, the dock moves one way and then the other step moves the other. And if someone's behind you, they fall off. It's like walking on a string bridge, suspension bridge. So I just don't understand how it can be done safely and accomplish the goals. It's outside my knowledge.
And when I'm thinking about this, there must be a way to do this. If ecology is saying that we have to, or the design to avoid this outcome, then I guess we're there. I mean, why? We're going to have to, whoever builds this float or dock is going to have to conform to what they're asking. So it seems like we're kind of arguing a point that we don't have really a lot of control over. Am I not thinking right here, or?
I think we don't necessarily, I mean, if you go back and look in the state law, you're not going to find any sort of standard that says floats have to have 50% transparent material. The goal in that language, as with a lot of these other things, is to reduce the impact that these allowed structures would have on the environment and the ecological function. So perhaps there could be additional language about allowing other innovative approaches to achieving light transmission, or moving that down from 50% to something else, or inserting a provision in there that says, you know, whatever, a maximum percentage, you know, that still enables safe operation or something like that. But, you know, at the end of the day, if we take that out and there is no requirement to try to mitigate the effect of that float, you know, sitting there above the substrate, then, you know, we'll be looking at that and analyzing that during the cumulative impacts analysis. All these standards we're kind of talking about are intended to minimize impacts to the shoreline ecological functions. And so things that we remove, you know, we'll have to be looking at what are the impacts of those decisions. And if, you know, all these things are permitted, what's the build out and what are the impacts, and are we achieving no net loss of the program?
I like the option you just laid out, Andy. You know, give some flexibility so that you can design it.
Yeah. Okay. So what if I can remember what I just said. So essentially allow for the percentage of material that would be considered light transmitting, allow that to be less than 50% if there's a safety concern, or also, you know, promote, enhance, otherwise state a preference for other strategies of reducing, you know, or increasing the light transmission below it. I'm not, you know, without going back and doing some more research, I'm not sure what those are, but, you know, at the end of the day, the goal of that is to try to reduce the impact of that use while still allowing that use. Okay, how do folks feel about that? Yep. Okay. All right. All right, let me just take some notes here and we'll move on. Okay. So we had questions so moving on to the use, or whoops, sorry, new and expanded mooring structure standards in critical saltwater habitats. So there were some questions raised about some specific development standards for new moored structures and whether they originated from state law. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to that section. This is mooring structures. So, you know, the stuff that's highlighted here, letter C, that newer and expanded mooring structures shall be located. And then it provides all sorts of, you know, development standards for that. So horizontal distance 25 feet from the edge of the structure to the native aquatic vegetation, 4-foot vertical distance from eelgrass or relevant submerged aquatic. So the question was, where did this language come from? Is it state law? And so I went back and looked, and it is not in the WAC. So this is not required language from the state, but it does come, it seems some of it appears to come from the SMP handbook. And once again, you know, designed to minimize the impact of these structures on the shoreline environment. And specifically in this case, these standards would only apply in critical saltwater habitat. And the goal there is to advance a higher level of protection because these are habitats that are deemed to be very important and sensitive to disturbance and things like that. So that's why this language is in here, but I'm circling back and answering the question that, you know, that specific language is written is not required by state law. The intent is to provide protection of the shoreline and advance no net loss of ecological function. So that said, I'm not sure if there was a question if there was a call to remove it if it wasn't there in state law. I can't, all my notes say where it doesn't have a basis in state law. So the answer is no, and I will turn it over to the Planning Commission as to whether there's any desire to change this or to leave it or anything else. If not, we will move on. Okay, marine rail systems. So there was some talk at a previous Planning Commission meeting about what does that mean? And essentially it's a set of rails that launch a boat into the water in place of a boat ramp. And so the question was, is that an industry term? Because that might be confusing because it says marine, it's got the word marine in it, and we think Puget Sound. Does this apply in lakes? So I talked to Ecology, and you know, they said, yeah, it seems to be an industry term. And from what I looked at online, it also seemed to be, you Google it and you look for people that are going to come and install those things. They'll say, we'll put this marine rail system on your lake. So, you know, it's kind of used interchangeably in that sense, which is confusing because in other places, those terms mean two different things. So I would recommend, and Ecology recommended, replacing everywhere we see that language, replacing it with something like boat launch rails or something similar, just to clarify that. So we changed the definition and we would change the standards here in 19600. So that would be, losing my place here. Here we are. So page 123 here, the boat launching ramps, railways, and lifts. So everywhere we see marine rail systems, we would change that to boat launching rails or something like that. So
I'm okay with that.
Okay. I see Commissioner Carmen nodding, Ed, and Commissioner Simmons, Chair Simmons. Okay, great. And just FYI, this language here, you see it's pink. It's because I moved the standards up. I didn't change A through C. I just moved them up because it said these are preferred. Well, then if they're preferred, they should be listed first. So I did that. Okay, so I will make the change to boat launching rails. Okay. All right, so moving on. So the next question that you guys had and asked me to research was some language in the draft that says, if you are doing a new residential development of 2 or more lots, you have to do a joint dock and you have to record an agreement as to how that dock is going to be used by the people who are able to use it. So the WACs do say that jurisdictions should require joint use docks for more than 2 residential lots unless it is infeasible for some reason. But there is nothing in there that I found that would require recording a legal instrument. I think that language is in there to protect people and to prevent conflict in the future, but it's not a requirement. And so circling back with Planning Commission to see if there is a desire to change anything with that. And I'm trying to find my notes here. Let's see. Okay, I think all it says is circle back with Planning Commission. So anyway, this is a requirement that we have in the draft, but it is not required by state law. So any thoughts on that?
When you say it's not required by state law, I assume you mean like by the GMA or something, because on the laws on, I mean, if you're doing a plat or something, I mean, if people have property rights to an area of land, you're going to want to file some, but I don't know why it needs to be in the Shoreline Act. I would think it would, the landowner who is dividing the lot up would need to file it anyway.
Right. So any other, and yeah, you're right. I mean, I had that thought when I was looking at this too. And let me go ahead. I'm not even sure what I'm sharing anymore. Flip over to the draft here. So letter H here, this is what we're talking about, proposed moored structures for new residential development, 2 or more dwellings. So, I mean, you're right, Commissioner Fleischer, when plats get recorded, they have all sorts of restrictions on them that bear legal weight. And so it's quite possible that that would already be something in there. This is saying, you know, if not, or even if so, this language was requiring something separate to be recorded that specifically dealt with that. I suppose that the legal instrument could be a note on the plat, but, you know, this makes it.
Do you know where this came from?
Regardless.
Do you know where this came from?
I don't, because yeah, again, it's not from the Shoreline Management Act. That much I know, but I'm not sure. It could have been based on review with current planning and things that they like to see and review, or you know, shared or learned experience on, you know, how development agreements shake out and things like that. But I don't know 100%.
I just think that it's a practical legal thing that they'll have to do on their own, and just to put it in here is just added words.
Mm-hmm.
It does protect them by doing it, but
Develop
Hey,
several
Andrew,
questions. First of all, whose properties are going to be on? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to do the maintenance? Who gets to use it? If we get into that, we're going into a completely different area than just shoreline management.
Well, to me, this seems like the only time it would really apply is when there is a single developer developing multiple lots at one time, and he would still own all the lots. He's putting in the dock for however many lots he's putting in. It's not like it's going to be 2 separate people that own property next to each other, then develop at separate times and have to come up with a joint dock plan.
Right.
Correct.
And we also, I believe the Planning Commission requested to remove the language that required individual landowners to seek those joint dock agreements with their neighbor. I already took that out. So this is a bit different. This is for new development, and this is for new plats essentially, or rather new development of 2 or more lots. So I've heard.
Hello, Andrew. Raul here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead. Hello.
Yeah. So basically, the requirement would be for a new development that is taking place where a person is developing 2 or more lots. So that kind of simplifies it. I think that the way it's written is actually pretty straightforward, and it encourages the new developer to actually combine the effort and create one dock rather than create multiples. I think that he could actually, it would be wise for him to have a recorded easement. That way he doesn't have disputes among the users of the dock. But I think just the mere requirement that they have to have a share dock would force him automatically to record an easement for such egress, which would be no different than the driveway. And I don't think we need to say any additional language on whatever the state law says.
Yeah, and to clarify my previous statement, just the first part of this, the whole piece about, you know, proposing shared moorage for 2 or more dwellings, that does come from state law. They say you should be doing this unless it's infeasible. The second is not from SMA.
I'd be in favor of taking that second sentence out. I like the first sentence, but I don't think the second sentence is needed, and let the landowners and developers figure out how they want to document.
Well said.
Right.
Okay. I think I've heard enough of you echo the same thought that I will take that note and we will move on. Okay. The last item in this memo is conditional use permit requirements for buoy fields. And this is just circling back on a clarification, a minor clarification with Planning Commission. Recently, you requested that staff remove the requirement for marinas to obtain a conditional use permit. So I went ahead and did that, and it now says substantial development permit instead. However, buoy fields are also, they were lumped into that same category with marinas. If that buoy field is serving 10 or more vessels, it was required to have a conditional use permit. I just wanted to confirm with Planning Commission that you would prefer that it be a substantial development permit, or however you would like to see that handled. I didn't have that clarification in my notes from last time.
I'd like buoy fields treated the same as marinas.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay. And that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, it's a lot less infrastructure. So, you know, it would not make sense to me to, if we're removing the requirement for a conditional use permit for a marina, it would not make sense to me to keep it for buoy fields. So, okay. I will update the draft so that they are the same as marinas. Okay. So that is all the issues that I fleshed out in the memo. I do have some additional information for you on industrial uses in shoreline jurisdiction, mussel raft and net pen aquaculture standards, and then, you know, property line fencing in SMP. So those are all potentially fairly meaty topics, and I did want to do a time check and see what the Planning Commission would like to do. I also know that we want some time for staff updates as well.
So it seems to me that these could be quite time consuming, what we're talking about here, especially the aquaculture, well, all 3 of those items. Should we hold off on those until we have more of an opportunity to discuss?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I have a question. This is Kevin. There was a lot of good public comment, both written and verbal, and not much of it touched on the appendices topics we went over tonight, but some of the items you just mentioned touch on some of those. And then there were other things like Mark Hancock's recommendations about the postcard and the wording and things like that. Are you all going to be able to share any of your insights with us on any of those areas? And is that relevant for tonight or maybe at the next meeting?
I see Jennifer turning on her camera.
I can answer the postcard one because that's pretty easy. The Planning Commission back in, I believe it was December 2nd at your meeting, where we went over that proposed postcard language, and the Planning Commission agreed to what the language should read on the postcard. So that's what's going on the postcard. It's been previously reviewed by the Planning Commission. As for the other public comment, that is provided to the Planning Commission for your consideration. And if any of that inspires you to request additional changes to the document, that's usually the path we take with those kind of written and oral public comments. Those are for you and for your consideration, and then you can deliberate those and then provide some direction to staff based on those. Staff provides direct responses to public comment that's going to be formally provided for the public hearing. So it's a little bit of a different situation. Once we're gathering public hearing comment, we usually have a public comment matrix and staff responses. And the comment you're getting through these meetings is really for you and for you to make some determinations on how you want to either request more information from staff or suggest different options to be added.
Hello, Jennifer. Raul here. I seem to recall that we asked to identify and provide us a list of those 2,700 folks or parcels that were going to be impacted and how they were going to be impacted. And also, we requested a couple minutes ago that we request to see the postcard with enough time to comment before it's actually sent out. So I would imagine that's all part of the intent as well, right?
Oops. So we have the postcard in draft form. We're working on the GIS to create the mailing list. So we can go over those two things at your next meeting.
That'd be great.
So to clarify, Raul, was the request to see the list or to have an update on the number of folks or just whatever the latest and greatest is?
No, to see the list and where the parcels are located, to identify what parcels and exactly are going to be impacted by the change of the language, and also to see the postcard before it's actually sent out. I mean, we all have different ideas, and some of them are good, and some of them may be inconsequential, but it'd be nice to be able to have our input.
This is Jim. I don't think we necessarily need to see a list, but it would be nice to see an overlay on the map where it was affected.
Okay.
Yeah, and Andy, can you remind me if that's going to be ready in time for their next meeting, or? I know we had till the end of June that we were working on a GIS for that. It's quite an exercise.
Yeah, and then I think we bumped it out a little bit to be toward the end of July. So I'm not 100% sure, and Emily is of the office until later this week, or she might not be back until Monday. So I will ask her as soon as I see her and find out, and we'll figure out what is doable for Planning Commission. I did want to note that one thing that you'll also see is that we have been updating, we're working on the list, and that list is potentially going to look different than what it did prior, because we have been doing some analysis of exactly the interplay between critical areas and shorelines and exactly where things are changing, not just the designations, but rules and permitting and things like that. So making sure that we are being inclusive on that postcard notification. And then of course, as time goes on, our underlying data layers change as well. We've been doing a lot of work updating our wetlands layers, our water bodies, and our FEMA floodplains. All these things have been updated as this process has gone on. So we will have a list of parcels, and we will have a number of parcels that are most affected by this update, either because their designation is changing, their buffers are increasing, or they're coming into SMP jurisdiction for the first time. That may be a different number than what we have previously discussed, but it represents the most new, up-to-date, and complete analysis that we have done.
It's going to be larger, I think, than what we previously discussed.
I believe it is, but it is more notice to more people. And I think that is the intent of this entire operation.
Yep.
The other thing is we want to see the final draft of the postcard.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I think we're moving forward.
Yeah.
Andy, also, when you have the public hearing draft of the SMP ready, I'm assuming that you're going to be sending us all new hard copies. And also, I've heard a couple other people ask, is the county amicable to providing hard copies to anybody else, interested parties that have been following along with this?
So this is going to be, it's going to be quite a lot of paper, as you can imagine. And so yes, at Planning Commission request, we would provide hard copies for anyone who requests that. And I can follow up with the Planning Commission members at a later date and kind of take the pulse. I know some folks will want a paper copy, others may not. And so before we push print on that, we'll make sure people actually want that. but as far as the public, yes, we can provide printed copies. Typically what we do is we print a few copies that are available on reference. So we have some printed up and available in our building development center for people to come and peruse. If folks want, if they would like us to make them a copy of that document, we can do so, but we do charge for those resources, and it's on the order of, well, I don't know. I don't want to say because it's been a while, I'm not sure, but somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 cents per page. So we can also put it on a disc, or it'll all be online. Listen to me, make a disc. So anyway, yes, we'll have it available for people to review as a reference material. We can certainly make copies for them at cost if they wish for us to do so.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. And just so you know, yes, I will be working on, we'll cover some of these lingering policy items at the next meeting. We'll have an update on the postcard for you, but in the meantime, I'm working on putting all these things in the draft and getting that ready for that ensuing public hearing. So with that, I will sign off and thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. Staff,
Thanks, Andrew.
Jennifer.
Hi, yes, so I have a couple of updates. The first is the Board of County Commissioners considered the Planning Commission's recommendation to send the wireless code update to additional citizen review, and the board determined a path forward on that. So thank you to Jim for answering the board's call to be there on Tuesday for their deliberation. That was super helpful. And then the path forward that the board determined is this: the staff and the county's consultant will continue their current work of working through all the public comments received ahead of the Planning Commission public hearing, write up all those responses and develop maybe some potential options for the draft. Take all of that information to a stakeholder group for a 60-day review period. The Planning Commission, you, will be naming members to that stakeholder group. The board wants a balance of perspectives. So for your August 4th, I believe it is, meeting, staff's going to bring forward a list of just potential invitees for you to consider. And this is just based on frequency of public comment from different people from different sides of the issue. So it'll be a longer list, and then you can deliberate and discuss. You've heard from many of these folks before. And it's up to you. We are thinking about an 8-person stakeholder group. A little more than that gets tricky to manage. And it could be that a couple of planning commissioners want to be part of that stakeholder group. We've done that in the past, where planning commissioners have been part of stakeholder groups, which can be really helpful, but that's going to be up to you all. And once you've chosen your members, staff will arrange for that group to meet, review materials, deliberate approaches, all the things stakeholder groups do, but within a 60-day time frame. That's what the board set out. And then that group will provide their final recommendations or options back to the full planning commission. So this whole process will likely take us through October.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, Jennifer, but it looks like Ken, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Quick question, Jennifer. Do you know the length of the contract with the wireless facilities consultant?
I do not. That he provides multiple services to the county, reviews franchise agreements and other things, as well as working on the code update. And that contract is managed out of our prosecuting attorney's office. So I believe it would go through them if additional space was a need to be made for him to do that. But I believe he was at least going to be on board through the rest of this update process anyway.
I saw a large number of concerns in public comments about the consultants' ties to the industry, and I share those concerns.
Yeah, if you go back, the consultant, Ken, provided a really good kind of breakdown of his experience, and the Board of County Commissioners considers him sort of like staff. And so they are entrusting him to provide legal advice and experienced advice on this issue. So that's who we are working with on this issue. Any other questions about the stakeholder process?
Kevin, is that something you'd like to be a part of?
Who are you asking, Jim? I missed the first part. Oh, Kevin.
stakeholder group? Sure.
Okay.
You just got drafted.
Yeah. We're probably looking for, I'm sorry, Jennifer, but we're probably looking for maybe one other if somebody is interested. So let Jennifer know.
Yeah, or just let the group know when we come back on the 4th to discuss it. It's really up to you. The stakeholder group's intended to be kind of your serving the planning commission to provide additional input.
When you're picking or putting together the list of prospective stakeholders, are you mainly going to work off of the public comment list?
Yeah, so we received the formal public comment for the public hearing, but then we received a lot of public comment. Obviously, you did at each of your meetings running up to even the public comment period. And we have a longer list of sort of public comments that were coming in before that time. So all of that will be considered, and we'll probably pick the top, 5, 10 commenters, whatever, on different sides of the issue, since the board wants to make sure, there's sort of wireless facility providers, also concerned citizens, everyone's so represented. But you'll get that list, and we'll kind of indicate where they seem to be coming from in their comments, so you can have that information to make your decisions on who gets to be on the stakeholder committee, or who's invited. I guess they can decide if they want to be on it. Any other questions about that? Okay, one more update. The board voted on June 29th to add both the 3000 Pacific or atrium building tenant improvements and the Mottman complex purchase to the 2021-2026 capital improvement program by a vote of 2-1. The final adoption noticing on that is going out this week. I'm still waiting for the signed resolution back from the board, but that action was taken and is final. So any questions on that? Those are my updates.
Jennifer, I have a question related to what we've been just talking. Are we considering yet about going back to live meetings?
We are. So it's a logistical hurdle. If we're going to do live meetings, we're also going to be doing them virtually. So we're maintaining both options for people. And to do that, we have to figure out the logistics of using room 280 for that, because 152 won't support it, which was the old meeting room. So we're working through that. We've all along planned to have a Shoreline Master Program public hearing with a live and virtual component. So that's definitely a mark we're trying to hit for that hearing. For all the other meetings up until that public hearing, which at this rate will probably be in the September timeframe, we may just be staying virtual while we work through those logistics, but I'll keep you posted.
Great, thank you. So we're doing calendars here. Will anybody be absent on July 21st?
I may be late to the meeting. I think I'm supposed to land at SeaTac at about 6, but I'll try and call in on the phone.
Okay, going somewhere fun?
I'll go down to visit my son down in Los Angeles.
Oh, perfect, great. How about August 4th? Okay, is anything else anybody needs to bring up real quick? Okay, no, we are adjourned. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.